Hello, I'm Tim de Man, game music composer. Tears of the Kingdom released this year, and despite feeling conflicted on the game as a whole, the soundtrack made me feel really... Sorry, I shouldn't be so hasty. Today I wanted to talk about music in 3D Zelda games, see what makes them tick, what makes them awesome, and, in an effort of utter reductiveness, rank them! This video will encompass soundtracks from Ocarina of Time from 1998 up until Tears of the Kingdom in 2023. In that time a lot has changed, but usually one thing has stayed the same. Zelda soundtracks are awesome. Despite the games industry moving more and more towards texture-driven, movie-inspired soundtracks, Nintendo has been a stalwart defender of the old ways of game music, catchy, melodic and elegant. So this is going to be a glorious victory lap for Zelda music. One little disclaimer, 2D Zelda games often have great soundtracks as well. Link's Awakening and in particular A Link Between Worlds come to mind. Both of these could definitely hold their own in this ranking, but for the sake of time I won't be including them. Hilda's theme alone makes A Link Between Worlds a top 5 one for me though. The way this works is, we'll go through every 3D Zelda soundtrack chronologically. We will be ranking each game on a scale from 1 to 10. The first 4 points are for overworld and town music, where most of all the juicy jams will be. Then 3 points for dungeon music, which is often more ambient. 2 points for incidental and cutscene music, and finally a wildcard amount of points for the secret sauce. Does the soundtrack have something special and unique? In the end, we'll see what the final ranking is and where Tears of the Kingdom ends up. Let's go! Ocarina of Time, 1998. Composed by Koji Kondo. Ocarina has for long been a benchmark of 3D action games, but musically it's a bit of a weird duck. Of the 7 3D Zelda games, it's the only one written by an individual, Koji Kondo. Sequel Majora's Mask already had a bit of composing help, and Kondo, just like his contemporary Nobuo Uematsu of Final Fantasy fame, had one foot still in his catchy chiptune roots, while the other one was entering more ambitious territory. This results in a soundtrack that runs the gamut between classic Kondo earworms like Kokiri Forest and complex time signature shenanigans like the final boss track. Overworld. The overworld music in Ocarina is juicy. The amount of bangers is unreal. Kokiri Forest, Hyrule Field, Castle Town, Epona Song, Hacking Gerudo Valley. It's nonsense. It's getting full points. Dungeons. I'd argue that few Zelda games did ambient dungeon music as well as Ocarina did. Low choirs, weird sound effects, spooky percussion. It's as far from Kondo's usual MO as it gets, and he absolutely nails it. The forest, water and spirit temples in particular are favorites of mine. The middle boss music is killer, but I've never been fond of the main boss track. It just feels grating to me with the shrill blamp of the trumpets. 2.5 points. Cutscene and incidental. Many cutscenes use existing music, with a few exceptions like Ganondorf and Sheik's themes, which are awesome. Also, that title screen track, Song of Storms? Yeah. Full points. Secret sauce. Ocarina of Time takes the ocarina from Link's Awakening and turns it into a fully fledged gameplay mechanic. You can freely play the instrument pentatonically and can trigger songs that impact the game world. If that's not special sauce, I don't know what is. Ocarina gets 1 special sauce point, bringing the total to 9.5 points. That's a great start. Immediately, this is the soundtrack to beat. Will any game beat it? Let's find out. Majora's Mask, released in the year 2000 by Koji Kondo and Toru Minegishi. Majora had a very different sound compared to Ocarina, which is commendable considering the short development time and identical sound hardware, which was still a big deal back in the day, because most games had to rely on onboard synthesizers to play back the music, strongly shaping the character of the end result. This time Kondo had help from Toru Minegishi, who composed the combat pieces. Minegishi would keep writing for Zelda for years afterwards, and later became the lead composer for Splatoon. Overworld. Majora brings back a killer rendition of the classic Zelda overworld music, a track I'm usually not particularly fond of, but this version has an amazing amount of drive. Clocktown is classic Kondo. Despite reusing quite a lot of tracks, like certain other games, Majora succeeds in having such a strong and often unsettling musical identity of its own that the reused Ocarina tracks feel like a relief when they come up. These new tracks, despite being often brooding, are fantastic. This all being said, the regions all use the same motif in different arrangements in contrast to Ocarina having all original tracks. So 3 points. Dungeons. The amount of dungeons in Majora is a lot lower. This is compensated somewhat by the incredible amount of side content. However, for this category it means there's just less awesome to go around in a game from the same period on the same hardware. The tracks that are here are killer though. Kondo succeeds in creating another set of distinct and memorable atmospheric tracks. It's a little more melodic compared to Ocarina, which I appreciate. Also, the boss music written by Minegishi is incredible. Two points. Cutscene and incidental. The oppressiveness of the game really comes through in Majora's cutscene music. This is heavy, slow, solemn stuff. I guess that's what you get when you set an utterly ridiculous deadline on your development team. Full points. Secret sauce. This game is the perfect case of musical secret sauce. The sound is distinct. The frequent use of dissonance and unnerving sound effects drives home the oppression super well, which incidentally makes this game really hard to play for me. For its emotive power, it's getting 1.5 secret sauce points, which brings Majora's score to 8.5 points. Wind Waker, released in 2003. Composed by Kenta Nagata, Hajime Wakai, Toru Minegishi, and Koji Kondo. Returning from Majora's Mask, Koji Kondo and Toru Minegishi are joined by Star Fox 64 composer Hajime Wakai and Mario Kart 64 composer Kenta Nagata, responsible for the absolutely legendary Dragon Roost Island, a track some future games got a lot of mileage out of. The Wind Waker soundtrack overall goes for a light sound. There's a distinct Celtic tinge to it, which I appreciate. I even did a Celtic Wind Waker medley. Wind Waker is the 3D Zelda game I've played the least of. I never got along with Forsaken Fortress, but would try my best to give the music a fair shake. Overworld. Holy cow, despite there not being an awful lot of it, the overworld music for Wind Waker is amazing. Dragon Roost Island, Windfall Island, Outset, the Great Sea. What makes Wind Waker extra interesting is that it actually reuses a lot of motifs from Ocarina. Forest Haven, for instance, being obviously based off of Kokiri Forest, but in general it adds enough to give it its own spin. I especially love what Windfall does to its Kakariko Village influences and what the Great Sea does with Hyrule Field. Lovely stuff. But as I said, not a whole lot, probably because of Wind Waker's truncated development time. It's still getting 3 points. Dungeon music in Wind Waker has a more sparse sound compared to its predecessors, leaving more room for environmental sound. Hyrule Castle references the Link to the Past Hyrule Castle theme in a spooky way, which I really like, while Wind Temple is a more involved sounding dungeon track than most. In general, I do miss the lushness and creativity of Ocarina and Majora soundscapes. These dungeons can sound quite barren and unfinished. Aside from the great mini-boss music, something new for Zelda is that every boss gets its own music. Phantom Ganon, Helmer King and Molgera are standouts, and they even get a second variation. Godown's technological fugue sounds almost like Final Fantasy in the very best of ways. Finally, Wind Waker may have the best final boss music in the series. A more critical remark, the onboard MIDI of the GameCube doesn't do too well on these higher energy combat tracks. They're very blarpy sounding, which will rear its head later on. For the N64 games, this made sense considering the restraints of the time. Many games from that era, even on PC or PlayStation, used onboard MIDI, with a few exceptions like the incredible Panzer Dragoon. The GameCube generation introduced more live recordings, or generally higher quality music rendering, of which Wind Waker does not make use. It's getting 2 points for the dungeons. Wind Waker has more cutscenes than previous Zelda games, so there's a lot more incidental scoring. This often uses existing themes, which is good, because it allows the melodies to be heard and remembered, a subject we'll return to. I really like the comedic tone of these cutscenes, and how well the music supports what they're going for. The Wind Waker isn't as musically interesting a gameplay mechanic as the Ocarina of Time, though. It's mostly just there. It's got a few cute baton stingers, though. The title screen is an all-timer, as well as the opening track, The Legendary Hero, which previews the Sage's music that will be used later. Grandma's Song, Farewell Hyrule King, Pirates, full points. Secret Sauce. Wind Waker's sound follows the colorful anime aesthetic of its graphics. Its Celtic influences could have been used more consistently, but when they do, it's a delight. Interestingly enough, it's a very Koji Kondo sounding soundtrack despite the man himself not even being involved in it that much. He only wrote the legendary hero and Grandma's Song. Wind Waker reuses many motifs from earlier Zelda games, but crucially not only references these, but keeps working with the material, turning it into fantastic new tracks that can stand on their own 2 feet. Supremely melodic, catchy and elegant, the Wind Waker soundtrack makes me wonder what they could have done if they'd had a year of extra development time. Perhaps some more lush dungeon music, a more refined general sound? Oh well, it's still getting a secret sauce point. Which brings the Wind Waker's final score to an 8. Twilight Princess, released in 2006, by Toru Minegishi, Asuka Ota and Koji Kondo. Twilight Princess takes quite the departure from previous Zelda games musically. Twilight Princess's music is more of a slow burn. Some like Orden Village or Ilia's theme are still supremely hummable, but a lot of important tracks are a bit more twisty. Midna's theme is an obvious example of this, just like the title track and Lake Hylia. Hummable still, but only after a bit of practice. Composing duties were handled by the returning Toru Minegishi and Asuka Ota, who this year handled composing for Pikmin 4. Kondo was sound supervisor, and many of his original themes are reused. Overworld. Once again, overworld music is where Zelda shines. Twilight Princess's Hyrule Field gives Ocarina's a run for its money, which is quite the achievement. It's also similarly dynamic, changing when in combat and depending on the time of day. Then there's the nostalgia fests Orden Village, Ranch and Lake Hylia that never fail to transport me back to 2 years ago when I first played Twilight Princess, and they still make me feel nostalgic. Other tracks like the percussive but short Gerudo Desert or the unremarkable Castle Town leave less of an impact, and with the Zora and Goron tracks being reused from Ocarina of Time, I'll have to dock a point. It's getting 3 points. Dungeons. Dungeons don't have that lush Ocarina or Majora sound again, just like the Wind Waker, but the digital sound of the Twilight Realm that often seeps through give it a distinct character. I particularly like how the dungeons start sounding progressively more strange and otherworldly. Temple of Time, City in the Sky and Palace of Twilight come to mind. Unfortunately, once again, the boss music doesn't fare as well. Overworld and dungeon tracks work reasonably well with the onboard MIDI, but the more large-scale, epic and orchestral work of the boss battle tracks end up sounding a bit grating. That's not a fault of the compositions, by the way. Just listen to how much the Daya Baba music livens up when played by a live orchestra. In 2006, this onboard MIDI approach was already very outdated. Fable on Xbox, Final Fantasy XII on PS2, or Baiten Kaitos on GameCube present fantasy soundtracks with a much more organic sound. Because of that, I'm going to dock a point. 2 points. Cutscene and incidental. Twilight Princess is a cinematic game for Zelda standards. While the story is messy, it tries to do a lot, and it has some excellent twists and turns. Musically, there's a lot of extra material to support the cutscenes. Just look up the OST on YouTube, it's enormous. Also, Midna's Lament. Full points. Secret sauce. We've returned to the segment where I can give as many points as I want. Twilight Princess succeeds at seeking its own musical path. A bit more subdued, dark and musically challenging, but very memorable and melodic in its own way. I think it does extremely well in this regard, and I would give it 2 secret sauce points for that, but the lackluster onboard MIDI brings it down. So I'm giving it 1.5 secret sauce points, bringing us to 8.5 points. Skyward Sword, released in 2011 by Hajime Wakai, Shiho Fuji, Mahito Yokota, and Takeshi Hama. Skyward Sword finally brought Zelda soundtracks to the modern age, ditching the aging onboard MIDI the series had relied upon so far, and instead using, altogether now, GarageBand. No, seriously, Koji Kondo once again oversaw composition and helped flesh out the arrangements in GarageBand. So yeah. And also live orchestra. Where Twilight Princess went for dark and warm, Skyward Sword goes for bright and punchy. Mario Galaxy mastermind Mahito Yokota came aboard and wrote some absolute bangers, as well as Animal Crossing and 2D Mario composer Shiho Fuji, who wrote some absolute bangers. Anime composer Takeshi Hama came aboard for his narrative composing expertise and wrote some absolute bangers. Finally, Hajime Wakai returned and wouldn't leave 3D Zelda composing from here on out. Also, he wrote some absolute bangers. Overworld. The Sky is supposedly Skyward Sword's central overworld music, and it unfortunately doesn't leave much of an impression. Like the Sky itself, it's just kind of there, and it doesn't compare to the Great Sea or any of the field tracks. The rest of the overworld is nuts though. Faron Woods, Lanayru Sandsea, Skyloft, Lake Floria, Small Island. It's all supremely melodic, chill, and with that beautiful mystical tinge that envelops the entire game. Also, even the tracks without live players are meticulously arranged, with small percussion, effects work, background layers. Did I mention Lanayru Sandsea? Full points. Dungeons. Full points. Cutscene and... No, seriously, let's talk about the dungeon music. Cloudview Temple has the thickest, dustiest, most spore-filled dungeon music I've ever heard. You can practically smell the dungeon listening to this. Earth Temple has some fantastic driving plucked strings, the mining facility is instant stress with its tuned percussion and reed instruments, Ancient Cistern heavenly where it needs to be and hellish where it should, and it all fits and is super melodic and memorable. Interestingly, there's a few live instruments in here, but it's mostly virtual instruments, recorded MIDI basically. But because the MIDI isn't coming from the Wii's onboard sound banks, but has been produced externally, the quality of the samples and production quality is much, much higher. These tracks are thick with vibes and continue the Zelda tradition of non-Western instrumentation in a glorious way. I love them. So yeah, full points. And God, this boss music! Cutscene and incidental. Much of Skyward Sword's orchestrations went to this category. Many cutscenes have lush orchestral music. It's also supremely melodic, like Zelda should be. The romance music, the gorgeous Princess Mononoke-like Koji Kondo composed opening, Ballad of the Goddess, Fi's theme. Full points. Secret sauce. Dang, Skyward Sword is already at 9 points and we've still got the secret sauce points to give. So will this be the soundtrack to beat Ocarina of Times? Yes, it absolutely is. Skyward Sword is lush, distinct and varied. It finally brought Zelda music into the modern age from a sound engineering standpoint, establishing a strong identity of its own and, very important, held the banner of melodic game music high. Skyward Sword's final score is a 10. Let's see if the open-air games can beat this. Speaking of open-air, I've actually written 2 albums of Zelda-inspired original work. Both albums are called Open Air, and they're on Bandcamp and your favorite streaming provider. Stylistically, they're somewhere in between Breath of the Wild and Skyward Sword, which might be the perfect place to be. Speaking of which, Breath of the Wild, released in 2017. Composed by Manaka Kataoka, Yasuaki Iwata, Hajime Wakai, and Koji Kondo. This is the only game, aside from Ocarina of Time, where I am able to write out the composers' names by heart, and that's because I've lived and breathed this soundtrack. I started this channel in 2016 when the game was revealed, arranging the main theme, and have arranged 44 of its compositions for piano since. There's an ebook for patrons, so this is going to be an easy one. Or is it? Because there's one thing Breath of the Wild did that's been bumming me out. Manaka Kataoka is the main composer along with Yasuaki Iwata. She's been at Nintendo for a while and has composed for Spirit Tracks and Animal Crossing New Leaf. Iwata was a more recent hire, starting with Mario 3D World and Mario Kart 8. Hajime Wakai returns once more, and Koji Kondo has co-composed a few tracks as well. Overworld. Breath of the Wild doesn't have music. Was a cliché phrase after its release. It is, of course, nonsense. Its soundtrack is of a similar length as Skyward Sword's or Twilight Princess's. But Breath did change its approach to overworld music as its overworld increased so much in size. Sparse piano phrases, sometimes randomly selected, and a lot of room for the gorgeous environmental sound. However, there's plenty of lovely musical moments in the overworld. A track like Ruin still has its own subtle melodic flair. It's using an amazing jazzy piano style that's fascinated me from the word go, and by studying it has tremendously improved my piano and composing skills. Melodies return in full force in the towns. Korok Forest, Hateno Village and Gerudo Town come to mind as great new material. Kakariko Village has a great traditional Japanese flair. The Gorons finally get some juicy new music after being stuck with the same music track since 1998. The Zoras, however, are still jamming along to Kondo's Ocarina track. The Rito Village music is also recycled from Dragon Roost Island, but it's overhauled in such a gorgeous way that I'm still impressed. In some areas, like around Death Mountain, we even get treated to a musical extra. Breath takes a step away from Zelda melodicism, and while I don't think that's too egregious here, I'm still docking a point for that and the reused themes. 3 points. Dungeons. These divine beasts have music that develops over the course of completion, which is a great addition. Often the track starts out with just some crunchy piano and synths, but becomes fleshed out more and more, often with delicious live instruments. Vamedo gets Ghibli-style soaring strings that capture the feeling of being suspended in the air amazingly well. Sitar, dulcimer, woodwinds and gamelan in Varudania, plucked strings and erhu in Vanaboris, glockenspiel and organ in Varuta, and strings, choir, bagpipe and taiko drums in the final trial. Hyrule Castle alternates between outdoor orchestral bombast and indoor spooky organ. It's gorgeous stuff. Boss battle music is mostly repeated, as was often the case in previous Zelda games. This is balanced out somewhat by the overworld bosses with their own themes, to say nothing of one of the best boss battle tracks in a Zelda game, Monk Mascotia. Personally, I find Skyward Sword's music to be generally more engaging, but I will still give Breath full points. Cutscenes and incidental. Breath in particular shines in its incidental music. Attack on Varuta, Attack on Vanaboris, the gorgeous tower-activated jingle, Mifa's theme, the Champions' ballad, Parasailing! Full points.
Secret sauce.
It takes Skyward Sword's live players and orchestrations and goes ham with it. It has a daring new approach to overworld music and turns my beloved piano into its signature instrument, with an amazing impressionistic style. It reduced focused on killer melodies, and that's a bit of a bummer for me personally, but I think it strikes a good balance between texture and songcraft nonetheless. There's a reason why I devoted years studying its intricacies. It's a true work of art, and it gets 9.5 points. And now, we're off to the finale! Tears of the Kingdom, released this year in 2023. A lot of new composers on the team. Ring Fit composer Masami Yoshi, Masato Ohashi, who's only done some Animal Crossing New Horizons work, and Tsukasa Usui, another new composer who's also done work for Mario Kart 8's Booster Course Pass. Manaka Kataoka returns, but Yasuaki Iwata is missing in action. Hajime Wakai returned as sound director though. Very cool to see a bunch of new names. Tears brings some new sounds to the mix and tries to establish its own identity. Live cello at various points, a sax or clarinet section for the Sky Islands, and some very cool oppressive synths for In the Depths. Does it succeed in creating its own identity? Overworld. Tears has multiple world layers, and each one has its own sound. However, the most visited layer by far is Hyrule itself, and it sounds a lot like Breath of the Wild, despite Hyrule not being half as serene anymore. I don't think it fits very well, and recently dedicated an entire video on the subject, and even wrote some new exploration music. Alright, so let's see how the town music fares, the element that made Breath of the Wild's overworld shine. Can't wait to hear what psychedelic vibes Hateno Village has gotten. See if you can spot the differences. Alright, maybe Kakariko Village has more changes. There's some funky new ruins in the town. Maybe we'll get some great new motifs to symbolize that. I won't belabor the point. All town music is reused verbatim. The story towns have variations on their breath music before you complete their questline, but afterwards it just reverts. Lookout Landing has a nice and fresh new track, Sari Town now has a night variant, and Gerudo Town has an underground track. All in all, it's meager. Underground we have those cool blarpy synths, but there seems to be only one single exploration track for most of the depths. On the Sky Islands is the same story, despite the woodwinds texturally sounding lovely. What's more, neither of these musical additions make any melodic statements. So yeah, Overworld falls flat. I can't really give it more than 1 point.
Gulp.
Dungeons. Fortunately, dungeons fare a lot better. They take the dynamic concept of Breath of the Wild, but make the contrast between each escalating layer, changing per lock opened, much larger. It can be said that each dungeon now has multiple distinct tracks. Each one is lushly arranged too, with orchestras going wild, spooky backwards vocals. It's tasty. I'm particularly fond of the Lightning Temple music. It's so good. Tears repeats Breath's 5 dungeons and Hyrule Castle approach. The 5th dungeon in particular has a gorgeous final phase, which I quickly arranged for piano trio. Unfortunately, it's barely featured in-game. In contrast to Breath, each boss has its own unique track, a step up from most other Zelda games which shared boss music. So for the ambition of its dungeon music, I'm giving Tears full points. Cutscene and incidental music. On this front, Tears falls flat. While there is a similar amount of incidental tracks, they leave less of an impression. The reason being, Tears either recycles motifs from Breath or misunderstands how Breath used incidental music as a way to make melodic statements. Tears' cutscene music is mostly utterly forgettable. The stable trotters have a cute incidental tune that almost starts going somewhere, but it's under a minute long and all in all doesn't leave much of an impression. The new characters' themes are utterly forgettable as well. Riju could have used a musical glow-up after not having much going on musically in Breath. Sidon's theme returns verbatim, but now with live flute, and his new girlfriend has a theme that's mostly new age music. Julin's theme is gorgeous, but is only heard so short that it doesn't leave an impression either. The champion in Breath had a similar situation, but because they took center stage in their own cutscenes, their themes had more room to breathe. It's all just not saying all that much. A notable exception for this is the ending sequence. The entire ending from the descent towards Ganondorf onward is musically impressive, and the final playable moments in particular are truly special. For that, I'm giving this a point. Secret sauce. Oh please, Timmermans, I hear you say, give Tears some of that sweet secret sauce points. Make it make sense! Tears of the Kingdom, just like its predecessors, tries to have its own musical identity. The synths are upped and the pianos used in a more sound designy way. The Sky Islands have a gorgeous, unique texture to them, and the depth sounds as terrifying as they feel. For the first hour until it gets boring. Tears take Breath's music, often literally, and saps out most of the melody. The melodies that remain are mostly short Breath musical quotes, but there's barely any fresh melodic statements at all. Kolgira is often mentioned as the best piece of music in the game, but even that is mostly orchestral texture work, or Rito Village, again. This is puzzling because there is a lovely motif for the Stormwind arc, but it's drowned out by so much texture that it's not really allowed to make its own statement. And that's my main problem with Tears' music. I was seriously pleading for the tiny little people in my television to start making some new, unique musical statements already. It seems afraid to stand out, to make an impression, and for one of the heroes of melodic game music, that stings even harder. The few exceptions being in the dungeon and boss battle categories, Makturok would have fit right in Wind Waker. And the seized construct is essentially Kolaktos again, with a similarly awesome track. I'll give it a secret sauce point for the clear attempts at making this soundtrack stand apart, but it just doesn't congeal or make true on its promise. Tears of the Kingdom's final score, 6 points. I'm sorry, folks. And now the conclusion. In last place, due to its lack of new melodies or memorable statements, Tears of the Kingdom with 6 points. Next up, the supremely catchy though slightly undercooked Wind Waker with 8 points. A shared third place for the two darker installments of the series, Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess with 8.5 points. A shared second place for the two games that made Zelda cultural juggernauts in their time frames, Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild with 9.5 points. And in first place, dethroning even my beloved Breath of the Wild, the shockingly complete, lush, catchy, and memorable Skyward Sword with 10 points. What do you think of this ranking? Have I huffed too many of those delicious-looking spores? Should I be forced to rebuild the Titanic using Ultra Hand as punishment? Am I absolutely right, and do I deserve to compose for a series of well-respected 3D fantasy adventures myself? Do let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.